Today on this episode of The Crossover, we will be discussing how 3D printing is transforming medicine with Director of the Health Design Lab and Professor of Emergency Medicine at Thomas Jefferson University, Dr. Bon Ku. Learn how this cutting-edge technology is impacting clinical care already and what the future holds for 3D printing within the medical field. Much more on this episode of The Crossover. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be talking with Dr. Bon Ku, who runs the Health Design Lab at Jefferson, talking about 3D printing in medicine. Hey, Bon, how you doing?
Hey, good afternoon.
How's everything?
Everything's going well. I am drinking my cup of coffee, but I wish I had a cool mug like yours.
Yeah, I know. This is a gift from one of my colleagues, Timur Urikoff. I want to give him a little shout out. So it's one of the best gifts I've gotten, I got to say.
Very cool. Good to see it like in real life, sort of.
Well, listen, man, I'm going to do a brief introduction just while everyone's logging on. We have the pleasure of speaking with my friend and colleague today, Dr. Bon Ku. He is director of the Health Design Lab at Thomas Jefferson, where he created the first design thinking program at a medical school. He is also a professor of medicine and design and the associate dean for health and design and a practicing ER physician. His work towards redesigning healthcare has been featured in the New York Times, CNBC, Architectural Digest, and Fast Company. Dr. Ku has also spoken about his work around the world and is host of the Design Lab podcast. He is also the author of the book, Health Design Thinking, and is a regular panelist on the primetime medical TV show, Chasing the Cure with Ann Curry. And here today to discuss something that I find absolutely fascinating, but how 3D printing is really transforming medicine. And I think as a neurosurgeon, we're just starting to see it. And I think reading up on your lab and the work you do, it's truly cutting edge stuff. So excited to talk today, Bon.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I think this is going to be really revolutionary in healthcare. 3D printing in medicine is really going to impact every one of us. So great to talk to you about it this afternoon.
Awesome. Let's start with basics, because I honestly, up till about a week ago, knew very little about 3D printing. What exactly is 3D printing and how does it work?
It's super simple. If you have ever put icing on a cake, that is a sort of 3D printing analogy. So you put the icing into the bag, and then you press on the bag and it comes out the nozzle. And that's essentially what a basic 3D printer does. You put material and you extrude it out of a heated tip, and that comes out of the tip and it hardens to form a structure. So it's usually turning a liquid into a solid. So there's a couple of different types of 3D printing methods, but that's the general gist of how 3D printing works.
Now, what about, I guess, the first question, what are the limits, right? Can you print anything? Like, what are the structural limits?
Yeah. Usually when we think of 3D printing, we think of plastics. That is the most common material that we see in 3D printing. If you've ever seen a 3D printer, you see these spools on the back that are plastic, generally the same type of plastic in plastic bottles, for example. But the technology has gotten so much better that the materials that you use to 3D print can be anything from resin, it can be glass even, to even titanium. And so we're seeing the applications of titanium in orthopedics and other specialties like yours, that you can actually 3D print with metals, which is like fascinating.
Now, one of the things that I was reading about was using 3D printing to improve surgical techniques, right? No matter how good we are, we can always get better. Explain how 3D printing can help surgeons practice, hone their skills.
Yeah. Well, I'll be curious to pick your brain about this. So we work a lot with our surgical colleagues, and currently you have the patient history and you have CAT scans and MRIs and a few other imaging modalities to help plan for surgery. So I look at 3D printing as another data point to help you plan for a surgery. We've seen the earliest use cases in complex surgeries, and that 3D printing has been helpful. So there are these really complex surgeries that don't happen that often, that a lot of our head and neck cancer surgeons do, and some of our orthopedic colleagues, of a cancer just eating away at the bone. And it's a very unique case, and it's a very challenging case. So we get asked sometimes to 3D print like a pelvis, for example, or the mandible and the head, neck, face anatomy to help plan for surgery. So our surgeons have found it super helpful because you rely upon tactile senses in the operating room, and some of these cases they can be pretty high pressured. So you want to plan for it with as much data as possible. And we found that with complex surgeries, it has been of tremendous help for the surgeons to help in the planning process.
So basically what we're talking about here is surgeons can see, touch, feel exactly what they're going to have in the operating room, but on a model.
Exactly.
And that's amazing. And then you're talking about orthopedics with the titanium and stuff and the pelvis. How good is 3D printing at replicating organs and replicating prostheses, implants? How good is it?
3D printing for anatomical structures is fantastic. It is literally one-to-one. Like it is, and I'm just going to give you some stories of our surgical colleagues that we're working with, because they come into our lab and they go, hey, I have this case where I'm doing a surgery on the kidney, and we're not sure about this technology. So we do a lot of experimenting. So it's like, okay, give us the CAT scan or the MRI, and we print it out and we give it to them. And what's been amazing is some of our surgeons have said, this was incredible. I've been doing this surgery for like 10, 15 years, but having a one-to-one model in my hands before going into the case was helpful, even though they're expert surgeons. So that has encouraged us a lot, that so much so that if I were undergoing surgery, I would actually 3D print that part of my body and just give it to the surgeon and go, hey, this is going to be helpful to you. Of course, we need more trials, we need more studies and looking at patient outcomes, but I'm telling you, like, some of our colleagues have been blown away of how helpful it is.
I mean, it makes sense, right? Because I can tell you, no matter how many times you've done a particular surgery, there's always variations. Every case is different. The veins, the arteries, the tissue, there's always variations. And so I think seeing what you're going to get into before you get into it, how can that not help? I also think the other interesting thing I was reading about was 3D printing for the development of instruments and medications. Tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, just to ask you, because we've talked to some of our neurosurgery colleagues, and sometimes it seems like you lack the specific tools needed for a certain case, for example. And I've even heard some neurosurgeons using tools that were developed for orthopedic surgeons because they're like, hey, that's going to be helpful in this particular case. I think that's crazy. Like, you should have a specific tool, even though that tool may be only used a couple of times a year. You should have that for that case. Like, why not? But to manufacture that for a medical device company is a lot of money. So I think 3D printing can decrease that cost to give you that very specific tool you need for that one or two cases for that patient. So it can be, I think it's like a game changer. And talking about 3D printing medications, yes, I think that's going to happen. But more exciting is being able to accelerate the development of new pharmaceuticals through what this thing is called, organ on a chip. So you could actually, we have the ability now to 3D print miniature models of how an organ might work. So you could actually test a drug in the early stages on an organ on a chip that's 3D printed, as opposed to doing it on an animal study.
Wow. That's mind blowing. I always tell our residents, anyone can do the surgery with the right instruments, but can you do the surgery with the wrong instruments? That's a good surgery.
That's crazy. Why?
No, I know.
Like,
of course,
you should have the instruments that you need, right?
No, I think having the ability to 3D print instruments and bypassing all of the crazy industry that is so expensive and so time consuming, I think that would be huge. The other topic that I found mind blowing is 3D printing for actual organs and skin. Tell us a little bit about that. That is just fascinating.
Yeah. So this is going to revolutionize humanity. 3D printing organs for transplantation. It's the holy grail of medicine. Right now I'm on the medical advisory board for 3D Systems. It's a company that actually invented 3D printing, and we're working with a company called United Therapeutics on this challenge. Can we 3D print organs for human transplantation? And the technology is something that it's remarkable. It's like they opened a door and showed me a machine that a time machine. Like the technology is that amazing. And the one company that 3D Systems is working with is called United Therapeutics. So their CEO is Martine Rothblatt. She was the CEO of SiriusXM. She's a serial entrepreneur genius, and her daughter has a disease called pulmonary arterial hypertension, and as you know, it's a fatal disease. So she's on a mission to save her daughter's life. So she created this company, United Therapeutics, to discover new drugs that would help her daughter, and she's on a mission to 3D print a lung for human transplantation. And last year, there was a big conference by CNN, and Sanjay Gupta was one of the hosts of it, and she held a 3D printed lung, an early prototype of it. And it's a remarkable, and to give you a sense of how complicated this is, it's like one of my colleagues, Jordan Miller, who's a scientist at 3D Systems, he says it's the organs are the most complex structures in the universe, and to be able to 3D print a lung, that's about 4,000 kilometers of capillary channels that you have to print. And if you're so accurate that it's like driving across the US and never deviating from more than a width of a human hair. So that's how precise you have to be to 3D print an organ. Like, you cannot mess up. I mean, they are it's the most complicated structure that's ever been 3D printed. So there's a lot of technology going on right now that's super exciting, that I can't really talk about in detail, but I think the future, we are going to be seeing 3D printed organs being transplanted into humans.
I mean, it's absolutely mind blowing. Someone needs a heart, someone needs a liver, someone needs lungs. Boom, 3D printed, no waiting for a donor, no, xenotransplants, none of that, just boom, 3D printed. How are we limited currently in terms of biocompatible and bio-friendly material, right? Because you were talking about plastic, glass, titanium.
Yeah.
That's great. What about putting organs in the body? What type of materials are available?
Yeah. Great question. So when we talked about 3D printing, in the beginning of our conversation, we think about the materials. And currently the materials that we use to 3D print are like metals and plastics, and we need biomaterials. So there's been a lot of research in 3D printed biomaterials, or the materials that use to 3D print. They're called hydrogels, and they're polymers that resemble the properties of our tissue. So it's pretty exciting that you could use these natural and synthetic hydrogels in order to 3D print scaffolds. So that's one rate limiting step that there's been a lot of research being done, a lot of amazing technological breakthroughs. So, but then we need cells. So like how you have these scaffolds, and how are you going to put cells on them, and how are those cells going to organize into working tissue? So those are two rate limiting steps of getting the biomaterials needed to 3D print.
God, that is above my pay grade. That is next level. That's unbelievable where that science is going. And like you said, it's really science fiction, and it's going to revolutionize humanity. I can't wait to see what the future holds. You had also mentioned about serial entrepreneurs in medicine, and people definitely make a living off of that. We all know people who see a need, and they really do a great job in developing new technologies. How has 3D printing accelerated entrepreneurship in medicine?
I think it's going to do it in every single way. One is what's that payment mechanism look like? How are we going to pay for this? Like, there's going to be these organs that are biofabricated, so there's going to be a lot of entrepreneurship around that. Transplanting these organs, getting them to the hospital that needs them, and because Martine Rothblatt is a serial entrepreneur, and she's also a pilot, and she has been investing in technologies of electric autonomous helicopters and creating an infrastructure network in order to be able to fly these organs to where they're needed. I think it's going to create a need for more transplant surgeons too, honestly. Yeah, and that absolutely. Kind of whole network as it becomes a lot more commonplace.
What is the current reimbursement model for 3D printed materials, products, implants?
There is none right now. I think there's going to be a lot of work on the policy design of how are we going to pay for this. And there's a lot of catch up that the FDA needs to do, the insurers need to do, because this is breakthrough technology, and we need to prepare for it. It is coming, and I think bioprinting organs has suffered from a long history of a lot of failed attempts, a lot of hype around there, and so I think that's why there's a little bit of hesitation to be excited about these new technologies. I totally understand that, but with the advancements of 3D printing, the advancements of biomaterials, it is on the horizon.
I think you mentioned FDA, and they're obviously front and center on this, right? Like, people can develop these instruments on their own or these products. What is the regulation? What is the oversight that currently goes into these products as they're developed?
The bioprinting organs aren't on the market yet. It's a weird way to talk about that, but so there is not that regulation. But I think what needs to happen is that companies start needing to talking to the FDA now in order to prepare for it, because it's going to be too late if they developing the technology then talking to the FDA. I think companies have to go hand in hand with the FDA in order to prepare for this certain future that's going to happen.
Now, everyone knows, just like I know, the FDA works at a snail's pace. What do you think the FDA is going to do? Are they going to be able to pivot and work at a faster pace, considering that there's going to be a tremendous demand for these 3D products, and it can't be the usual decade turnaround? That's ludicrous.
Well, I think the FDA does well when it's a life and death situation. And we saw that with the mRNA vaccines during COVID. That happened very fast. And the transplant list is long. It's like 100,000 in the US. People are dying every day. So I think there is this incentive that will accelerate uh, just be able to go through all the red tape that normally happens because lives are at stake and people will die by not getting off that transplant list. And so I'm optimistic that companies, researchers, the FDA can work hand in hand to accelerate this, just like we did with the mRNA vaccine.
Yeah, I mean, I really hope so. I think that there's going to be such a tremendous push that they're going to have no choice but to accelerate that process. I do think, like you said, it is important for these companies to talk now, get those negotiations going now so that you're just running them in parallel. And you mentioned the vaccine for COVID. I want to talk about the pandemic. Do you feel that the pandemic accelerated 3D printing? Because it certainly seemed like that from the outside, like the pandemic accelerated the development of 3D printing in the medical field.
100%, because what we saw during the pandemic was those traditional supply chains got disrupted, and there was a need to bring in-house manufacturing. And so we saw that with the shields that we wore, the face shields. But we all saw that with more sophisticated needs. So the nasopharyngeal swabs that we all have used to test ourselves for COVID, we actually ran out of those, or there was like a very limited supply the summer of the first year of the pandemic. There was a company and researchers in Florida that we had worked with, and we actually 3D printed 35,000 of these swabs in our own lab at our university to create a stockpile in case we did run out. So I think in the future, we're going to see these digital files for pandemics, for emergencies. So when supply chains become disruptive, then we could use those digital files and be able to 3D print nasopharyngeal swabs, face shields, surgical instruments, like things that we need immediately.
Yeah.
I want to tell you a funny story about this. The PAPRs, the purified air respirators that we had wore during the early part of the pandemic, we had a plastic piece that was broken from the hose to the connector, and so it made that PAPR this like potentially life-saving device, keeping us from getting COVID, useless. And so what we did was we actually 3D printed that connector in our lab in order to make that respirator work. So that's like one just great example of how 3D printing can be used for like on-demand in-house manufacturing in healthcare facilities.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a matter of if the next pandemic comes, it's when. So
exactly.
Being prepared obviously is huge. One of the more interesting things I was reading about is your health design lab. Tell us a little bit about that. Unbelievable what you started there, and kind of tell us what your goals are, your missions.
It's a great lab. The best way to describe it, it's like a test kitchen for the hospital. We are always creating new recipes. We're experimenting. We're prototyping, and we have two missions to push that in the research realm of exploring new technologies like desktop 3D printing, bioprinting, seeing their applications in the medical space. Also to teach human-centered design to medical students and to go beyond the walls of the hospital and think about how we can design healthier communities. So during the pandemic, we were running COVID-19 testing and vaccine sites in underserved communities in Philadelphia. So it's a way for us to apply our creativity in the healthcare space.
It's an unbelievable model. Do you know of any other people that are kind of imitating that around the country? It's an incredible idea.
We're seeing a lot more interest in human-centered design in medicine. So there's a couple of shops like at Stanford, they have the D School there. There's a lot of collaboration done with the Med School and the D School at Stanford. And I think I'm optimistic that we'll see more of that. We don't have too many labs that are doing this exact same work that we are, but I think there's this hunger to apply creativity in medicine. And I think there needs to be a space for that. I think there's also needs to be more 3D printing labs in the US and in hospitals. So we're seeing some hospital systems like Northwell and Mayo having 3D printing labs. I think there could be a lot more.
Yeah, I think this is just the tip of the iceberg. I want to ask ethical questions now, because just like artificial intelligence or any new technology, there's always an ethical component of it. Like, how far do we want to push? And so, the first question, how do we make sure there's equal access to all, right? Which is a problem in medicine in general, but 3D printing is going to be expensive. How do we ensure that everyone has access to all the benefits?
Yeah. Well, transplanting an organ from a human who has just died into another human is probably the most expensive thing that we do in medicine. So I think 3D printing organs is going to reduce that cost dramatically and make it more equitable. That if we have an unlimited supply of organs, that's going to drive down the costs. And I hope that every patient, regardless of their ability to pay, will be able to get an organ if they need an organ. And it's there's a lot of ethical questions about transplanting organs. Do we only do it when they fail? Do we do it when they're sort of failing? What about if we 3D print brain tissue in the future? What does that look like? I'd be curious to know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, so that's the other ethical question, right? Should we use 3D printing to enhance human function, right? It's one thing to replace a heart when you're in heart failure, or lungs when you have pulmonary fibrosis or what have you, but should we in the future use 3D printing to make stronger bones, stronger heart, better skin tissue, right? Should we be enhancing human function? Where do we draw the line?
You're the surgeon, so I'm gonna ask you that.
I mean, look, I think it's a very delicate topic, in the sense that once you cross that line, just like artificial intelligence, you're crossing into the unknown, right? We can definitely 3D print organs, or it sounds like we will be able to, better than the ones that we were born with. Now, are we playing God? It sounds like we're kind of playing God, and maybe we shouldn't be doing that. These are just questions that I think that are going to have to be answered at an FDA type level, because there is so much, lack of clarity. Like, where do we limit our advancements, and when are we pushing past what nature really intended?
100%. But I totally agree with you that the need for us to save lives with 3D print organs is there. I think we'd be preoccupied with that in the early stages, but I think we need to start asking these questions now.
Yeah, I think it's, I'm just glad I'm not the one making those decisions, because there is no right answer, right? There is no right answer, right? Like, if someone shatters their pelvis and you have to do a prosthetic pelvis and you 3D print part of that pelvis, how strong do you make that bone? Is it stronger than the normal bone? If an athlete wants to, enhance their knees, and they maybe want to get a knee prosthetic that's better than any human knee that's ever existed, is that ethically right? And I don't know. It's going to be very delicate. But wrapping up here, because I know you're super busy, give us your crystal ball view. Being on the forefront of medicine, 3D printing, seeing how the organ transplantation is advancing, what are some major medical breakthroughs you see happening at the hands of 3D printing in the next 5, 10, 15 years?
I can't give you a specific timeline, but I will say that we have never been closer to bioprinting organs for human transplantation than the history of mankind. So like we're going to be seeing remarkable breakthroughs in this space. And I also think we're going to see remarkable breakthroughs in how we develop drugs that, I think we're going to decrease the amount of animals that we're going to actually test on because of being able to 3D print organ on a chip. And that's going to really accelerate and decrease the cost of new drug discovery. So I think we're going to see that definitely within our lifetime, like soon.
That's crazy. Listen, Bon, I want to say thank you for your time. In short, I've learned so much talking to you and also reading before the podcast about 3D printing. I think it's very similar to artificial intelligence in the sense that crazy potential to really revolutionize civilization, just like you said, 3D printing organs, but kind of scary at the same time. Like I said, you're really playing God, you're crossing over ethical boundaries. So both super exciting and promising and scary at the same time. And, you being on the front line, it's great to hear what your impression is, seeing this develop. And anyway, it's very exciting times. I'm not sure what the future holds.
All right. Well, if I need a new brain, I hope you could put one.
I'm happy to put it in. I'm happy to put it in. I'll make sure all the connections are right. All right, buddy. Take care. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
All right. Pleasure.